The last speaker of this morning session represents the United States, General McMaster, the National Security Advisor to President Trump, who, as he told me earlier this morning, who is actually here for the first time. And this is why I offer you a particularly warm welcome, sir. Please take the floor.
Guten Abend. Thank you, Wolfgang. And I have been to Munich, but for Oktoberfest, not for the security conference. It's wonderful to be with all of you. You and your entire team, Wolfgang, thank you, have done a wonderful job organizing this important conference. I want to also thank Chancellor Merkel, the German government, and the German people for their generous hospitality and gracious welcome for the entire American delegation. For me, visiting Germany feels like coming home. And I know I speak for the entire American delegation when I say that we all wish that Senator John McCain, a great advocate for this conference, could be with us. It is a great honor to be here. The Munich Security Conference convenes an unmatched assembly of distinguished leaders and thinkers. For over 5 decades, the conference has fostered open dialogue, candid debate, and lively discussion about how we might build a more peaceful and prosperous future together. This year, we meet at a critical time for our nations, and indeed for all humanity. Critical because we face a range of common threats, rogue regimes that already imperil international security in the Middle East and in Northeast Asia are developing the most destructive weapons on earth. Revisionist powers are challenging the stability of the post-war international order through military force and other pernicious forms of aggression. And jihadist terrorist organizations continue to use the mass murder of innocents as their principal tactic in their evil war against all civilized people. Although distinct, these 3 threats often intersect, as they do, for example, in Syria. To address these threats and improve international security, we must renew our faith in the principles that have made our nation strong, increased worldwide prosperity, and prevented great power conflict for over 70 years. The United States, its allies, and its partners are proud nations of patriotic people who cherish the ideals of liberty, individual rights, free enterprise, equality, and the rule of law. In our free and open societies, artists, intellectuals, and inventors expand our hearts, enliven our imaginations, and push us toward new frontiers of science and exploration. We should be proud of what we have achieved around the world to safeguard our principles, defend our security, and unleash human potential. This month, we are celebrating that the Berlin Wall and the barbed wire fences that once divided the German people have now been down longer than they stood. I was here in Germany when the wall fell. Our cavalry regiment was patrolling the border near Coburg when East German travel restrictions lifted. That day, we experienced an invasion of an unanticipated kind. As joyous East Germans brought us flowers and bottles of wine to celebrate reunions, with their friends and family and to celebrate their newfound freedom. Those moments remain among my fondest memories when freedom triumphed over oppression. Our shared history reminds us of our common principles, our democratic values, and our enduring commitment to peace. Ewald von Kleist founded this conference in 1963, following two horrific world wars in the hopes of preventing future conflict. To realize his noble vision, we must all share responsibility. International peace and prosperity depends on all nations. For this reason, President Trump has called for stronger alliances and partnerships based on shared values, shared interests, shared responsibilities, and shared burdens. Today, I would like to highlight three priority areas that demand our collective efforts. First, ensuring the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and deterring their use. Second, defeating jihadist terrorist organizations. And third, strengthening the international foundations for peace and prosperity. Over the past 4 years, we have commemorated various 100-year anniversaries of World War I, a war that witnessed the routine use of chemical weapons, causing immense human suffering. In the wake of that war, nations came together and agreed not to use these horrifying weapons on the battlefield. In April of 2017, when the Assad regime again used these heinous weapons against innocents, the United States responded. We acted to deter future chemical attacks and to ensure that the use of these weapons never again became routine. Public accounts and photos clearly show that Assad's chemical weapons use is continuing. It is time for all nations to hold the Syrian regime and its sponsors accountable for their actions and support the efforts of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The non-proliferation regime is under tremendous pressure, not only from the use of chemical weapons, but also from the development and proliferation of nuclear weapons. It needs our unequivocal support. Last year, nations gathered here initiated an international campaign to denuclearize North Korea. We must pressure the Kim regime, using all available tools to ensure that this cruel dictatorship cannot threaten the world with the most destructive weapons on earth. Many of us can be proud of the successes we've had in uniting behind United Nations Security Council resolutions. Today, let us resolve not only to enforce existing sanctions, but also to commit to downgrading diplomatic relations, cutting off all trade, military, and commercial ties, and expelling so-called guest workers. Nations that evade full enforcement and fail to take these steps are acting irresponsibly. Now is the time to do more. And nuclear North Korea poses a direct threat to all of us and seriously undermines the non-proliferation regime. We know that Syria and North Korea are not the only rogue states developing, using, spreading dangerous weapons. Now is the time to address serious flaws in the Iran deal and counter Iran's destabilizing activities, including its development and proliferation of missiles and its support for terrorist proxies and militias that fuel destructive conflicts across the greater Middle East. The Iranian regime foments this violence with support from commercial entities affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC. Including Mahan Air, who lands right here, a company that lands right here in Munich Airport. As a matter of international security and moral conscience, we must stop doing business with IRGC-affiliated interests, encourage the development of a true commercial sector in Iran, and pressure the regime to respect the rights of its people. The second area that deserves our continued attention is defeating terrorist organizations that threaten our citizens and our way of life. In recent months, working together, we have made enormous strides in preventing terrorist attacks, denying terrorist control of territory and populations, cutting off their funding, and discrediting their wicked ideology. Over the past year, for example, we have come together in partnership to create 2 new centers in Saudi Arabia dedicated to countering jihadist ideology and disrupting terrorist financing. In Syria and in Iraq, our coalition to defeat ISIS has liberated territory previously held by these terrorists. We will continue our efforts to pursue ISIS fighters, secure populations, stabilize areas, and facilitate the safe return of those who have suffered so much under the grip of this evil organization. And in Afghanistan, our heroic Afghan partners are working alongside American, NATO, and international forces to ensure a better future for their children. If we all work together, we have an opportunity to act against Taliban and Haqqani network leaders, many of whom live in safety and luxury outside of Afghanistan, while plotting the murder of innocents. To ensure progress in counterterrorism and in nonproliferation, we must also focus on this third area that transcends all efforts: strengthening the international foundations for peace and prosperity. In this area, we have much work to do. International institutions created to foster peace and facilitate cooperation are under threat by nations that subvert and corrupt their intended purpose. For example, some of the most egregious human rights abusers sit on the United Nations Human Rights Council. And trade organizations like the WTO have been unable to constrain countries that ignore its stated principles and refuse to follow its rules. So we must actively cooperate to protect, reform, and strengthen these institutions so that they honor their original aims and serve the interests of states that value the rule of law and human dignity. As President Trump noted in his address to the UN General Assembly, the success of international organizations also depends on the strength of their independent sovereign members. Unfortunately, respect for sovereignty is under siege around the world. Some of the most dangerous forms of aggression today fall below the threshold of military action. We cannot allow repressive and revisionist powers to diminish our confidence in our sacred principles, to undermine our free market system, or to interfere in our democratic processes. As you've seen in recent days, the United States will expose and act against those who use cyberspace, social media, and other means to advance campaigns of disinformation, subversion, and espionage. We are already improving our ability to defeat these pernicious threats. For example, in April of last year, 9 countries, including the United States, established the new European Center of Excellence for countering hybrid threats. This center will help free nations defend against cyber attacks and political subversion, preserving our way of life through common action. Our nations are safer when we cooperate to advance shared goals. We are only as strong as our faith in our values, our pride in our heritage, and our resolve to do our part for peace. If we renew our commitment to our noble principles, together we can face today's threats and defeat them. We can uphold the non-proliferation regime. We can defeat jihadist terrorist organizations. We can protect our way of life, and we can fulfill the visionary dream of this conference's founder, that in the wake of two devastating world wars, our nations might come together to build a future of hope, light, and promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Time for questions. I'm looking around. Well, let's turn to our friend Kosachev from the Russian Federation. Can the microphone be offered?
Thank you so much. My question will be about cybersecurity. According to the data I received from the Russian experts, approximately 28% of cyber attacks from outside towards the Russian, let's say, electronic system come from the United States of America, 28%, while 2 to 3% of attacks coming towards the, let's say, American electronic system come from Russia, 10 times less. Would you like to either acknowledge or deny this data? And my second question would be, in any case, what do you feel about our repeated proposals to start a bilateral dialogue, a Russian-American dialogue on cybersecurity, which is being rejected all the time by the American side? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm surprised that there are any Russian cyber experts available, based on how active most of them have been against and undermining our democracies in the West. So I would just say that we would love to have a cyber dialogue when Russia is sincere about curtailing its sophisticated form of espionage, what you might call this modern-day sort of form of Maskirovka, enabled by modern technology. And I think that day will be coming because we're becoming more and more adept at tracing the origins of this espionage and subversion. And as you can see with the FBI indictment, the evidence is now really incontrovertible and available in the public domain. Whereas in the past, it was difficult to attribute for a couple of reasons. First, technically it was difficult, but then also you didn't want to divulge your intelligence capabilities. But now that this is in the arena of a law enforcement investigation, it's going to be very apparent to everyone. But the second reason where I think Russia may reevaluate what it's been doing is because it's just not working. So what's happened is in this effort to polarize our societies, to support rightist groups. I mean, even the most extreme forms of fascist groups, and then groups on the left in an attempt to pit Western societies against each other. All that is done is appeal to those big fringes while uniting all of our polities actually against Russia and Russian interference. And so, as you know, you might have heard in the United States, it's pretty difficult to pass bipartisan legislation these days, for example, across our parties. It is pretty difficult, except in one case, which is sanctions against Russia, where the vote was 98-2. That was made possible mainly by Russia itself and Russians themselves in engaging in this campaign of political subversion. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. We have a significant number of questions. We have only very limited time. If that's okay with you, we'll collect a few questions and then go back to you. I will call on the following, whom I think I recognize correctly. Herr Nick, Herr Lietz, Herr von Marschall, and Tzipi Livni. Lady goes last. Is that okay? This time, Herr Nick.
General McMaster, we surely appreciate the way you have praised the values underpinning our alliance and world order in the last decades. Can you help us reconcile these statements that you have made today with some of the core statements of your op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last spring, which I recall as having said, there is no such thing like a global community, there's just an arena where states and private actors compete for their self-interest, and that displayed a rather purely transactional approach to alliance statements that have raised a lot of concerns on this side of the Atlantic. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next one is Arne Lietz from the European Parliament.
Mr. McMaster, Arne Lietz, Social Democrat from the European Parliament. Nice to see you not only at the Munich Security Conference in Washington, but not also here. You mentioned several common threats and shared responsibility. We have had this topic with our EU President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker, about climate change and climate challenges. We are looking into it. We are bringing this up now in the foreign policy arena in the European Parliament. This conference has touched on that in a session as well. If you can elaborate, you mentioned 3 priority areas. Could that be a priority area as well, to share responsibility, to come to terms with the climate change? As I talked in Washington on that, on the Hill, to numerous groups, even to the security community, but also to governor situations. And so they've seen this as a great necessary, but also a great opportunity to work with this with Europe together. Thank you.
Okay, Herr von Marschall.
Christoph von Marschall, I'm a German journalist, but at the moment I'm the Helmut Schmidt Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Washington to do a study on the future of transatlantic relations. I want to ask you about modernization of nuclear weapons. There's some controversy, especially between the United States and Germany, and when it comes to tactical small weapons. In the 80s, the name giver of my fellowship, Helmut Schmidt, put his chancellorship on the line because he wanted that the United States modernize and be on the same level like the Soviet Union at that time. Could you explain us how the situation is today and why you think that modernization of American nuclear weapons, including the tactical weapons, is in European interest and why it's perceived here to the contrary?
And the last question goes to Tzipi Livni. And I apologize to all the others because General McMaster has an appointment which I think is beginning right now. So he'll have to leave really in a couple of minutes.
Thank you. How counterterrorism works when Secretary Tillerson was in Lebanon saying that we should recognize the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon's political life. I believe in bullet or ballot. They need to choose whether to use terror or to participate in political life. What is your position on this? And are there any concrete steps that the US is going to do regarding Iran and the steps and what they are doing on Syrian soil? Thank you.
Back to you, General.
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for those questions. In terms of the U.S. relationship with allies, when we talk about arenas of competition, we're talking about really competition between our free and open societies and closed and repressive societies. And I would refer you to the highly readable national security strategy that the president just released at the end of last year. And when we speak about arenas of competition, what this is really is a shift away from what had been a hopeful view of geopolitics, and that there would be a great power condominium that would help solve some of the biggest problems that we have and would lead to an era of enduring peace and prosperity. I think those dreams were punctured by the invasion of Georgia in 2008. You can even go back to the You can even go back to the denial of service attacks against Estonia in 2007. So what we have seen since then is a pattern of revisionist powers who are advancing what they perceive as their interests at the expense of free and open societies. So the U.S. commitment to our allies is stronger than ever. But I think all of us have to recognize the world as it is, and to recognize that if we don't compete, if we vacate these arenas, we are placing our own populations in jeopardy. We are emboldening those enclosed and repressive societies who are determined to advance their autocratic regime's interests at our expense. So I think we do have to compete, and the recognition that we have to compete is in no way incompatible with our desire for stronger alliances and stronger partnerships, a stronger transatlantic relationship, for example. On the second question, the President has made clear that the United States remains committed to climate and the environment, to have the cleanest water and the cleanest air on the planet. His biggest objection to the Paris Accord was that it gave the biggest polluters in the world a free ride. And so we remain committed to not only renewable energy sources, for example, but also to clean fossil fuels as a way to reconcile the need to reduce emissions with the need to continue to generate sufficient economic growth to build prosperity around the world. And then on the question on nuclear weapons, I recommend to you the Nuclear Posture Review. I think it's very clearly laid out there. The development of lower yield nuclear weapons was not designed to lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. It was designed to raise the threshold. And this is in recognition that Russia, in particular, is violating the INF Treaty and developing a range of weapons which Russia itself has said it will use under this construct of escalate to de-escalate. So what we will not do, we will not allow Russia or any other power to hold the populations of Europe hostage. We believe that this strengthens immeasurably America's extended deterrence and thereby lowers again the chances that we will ever have something none of us even want to imagine. And so I believe that this shift in our nuclear posture is important for the reasons stated in that strategy. And I think we have an opportunity now to have a really strong discussion about the consequences of violation of the INF Treaty and the instability that's creating not only in Europe but globally. And then finally on the question on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization, and we encourage all nations to designate Hezbollah in whole as a terrorist organization. And in terms of Iran's role, I think what you see now is what Hezbollah really is. What they've been doing in Syria as a proxy of the Iranians, and what they have been doing in receiving more and more missile and rocket capabilities and improving those capabilities to threaten Israel and threaten even further the stability of the whole region. And I think it's useful for us to take a step back and to see what Iran is actually doing in the region. And what they're actually doing, what Iran is actually doing, is applying the Hezbollah model to the greater Middle East, in which they want weak governments in power. They want the Arab world to be perpetually weak. And they have weak governments in power that are dependent on Iran for support, while they grow terrorist organizations, militias, other illegal armed groups that are outside of that government's control, that can be turned against that government if that government acts against Iranian interests. We see that this is the case in Syria, where they're building a large proxy army with a large cadre of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. We see this in Iraq, where they have grown these PMF forces and want to keep them there as, again, a Hezbollah-like force. And we've seen it in Yemen. And what's particularly concerning is that this network of proxies is becoming more and more capable as Iran cedes more and more capable weapons, more and more destructive weapons into these networks. So that the time is now, we think, to act against Iran. And, you know, when you look at the biggest investors in Iran, and when you invest in Iran, you're investing in the IRGC. You might as well just cut the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps a check and say, please use this to commit more murder across the greater Middle East. So when we look at the biggest trading partners with Iran, of course we see Russia, China, but we also see Japan, South Korea, and Germany in the top three. And I think it's time for all of us to focus our business intelligence efforts, figure out who we are really doing business with, and let's do everything we can to cut off funding to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we conclude this morning's session, let me remind you that those of you interested in the nuclear issues, including nuclear arms control, the session after lunch, beginning at 2:50, will continue to focus on those issues. General McMaster, thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank.